Hey everyone, this is a piece from Maximilien Rubel titled The Formation and Development of Capital in the USSR. I'm getting this from Bataille Socialiste. It's a libertarian Marxist archive in French, and this is getting translated from French with Google Translate. So the translation might not be perfect, it might be somewhat inadequate, but I'm going to give it a go, and hopefully it's sensible. Here we go. The masters and doctrinaires of the Soviet economy today proclaim urbi et orbi that the USSR has achieved socialism, or more precisely, the first phase of communism, as Marx understood the first phase of communism, and as Marx wanted the first phase of communism. However, if this were to happen, not only would the theses and hypotheses of Marx and Engels about the social future of Russia be refuted, but the whole materialist theory of history as a whole would collapse. On the other hand, if reality does not correspond to the proclamations of Soviet theoreticians, the Marxian theory of social evolution retains all its value, and Soviet, quote, Marxism reveals Soviet, quote, Marxism's self purely and simply as the ideology of the ruling class in the USSR, in other words, as an instrument of mystification and political oppression for the benefit of this class. Has the economic and social structure of the USSR actually become capitalist, as Marx and Engels had predicted in the hypothesis of the disintegration of the rural commune? Is the, quote, Great October then only a myth? This question, strange as it may seem at first sight, has already received an affirmative answer from the Marxist side. One second, gotta get to the end notes. One second. Come on. Cooperate, damn you. Footnote. Let us point out some of the Marxist attempts to present the current economy of the USSR as capitalist. See R.O. Worrall, USSR, Proletarian or Capitalist State, which is going to be on this channel soon. Have that read. Anton Pannekoek, The Workers' Councils, have part of that read. Pierre Chaloux, bracket, pseudonym of Castoriadis, and bracket, The Relations of Production in the USSR, I have that on the channel. Otto Rula, for the writings of this author, see the interesting study S. Frank Soziologie des Freiheil, Otto Rula's Auffassung vom Sozialismus, published in 1951. The anonymous article Structure Economica et Sociale de la Russia de Oggi, series of articles published in Il Programma Comunista, those by Bordiga, an organ of a communist opposition whose theoretician was Amadeo Bordiga. Tony Cliff, Stalinist Russia, a Marxist Analysis, 1955, and W. Leonhardt, The Soviet Union, 1953. The theoretical divergences that can be detected in these works of Marxist inspiration mainly concern the social nature of the dominant class, master of capital. I want to look up this last book because everything else I'd heard of. Looks like it's referring to a Wolfgang Leonhardt. Wikipedia says Wolfgang Leonhardt lived from 1921 to 2014 and was a German political author and historian of the Soviet Union, the German Democratic Republic, and communism. A German communist whose family had fled Hitler's Germany and who was educated in the Soviet Union after World War II. Leonhardt became one of the founders and leaders of the German Democratic Republic until he became disillusioned and fled in 1949, first defecting to Yugoslavia, then moving to West Germany in 1950, and later to the United Kingdom. In 1956, Wolfgang Leonhardt moved to the United States, where he was a popular and influential professor at Yale University from 1966 to 1987, teaching the history of communism and the Soviet Union, topics about which Wolfgang Leonhardt wrote several books. After the Cold War ended, he returned to Germany. All right, back to the text. End footnote. We do not claim, therefore, to be doing entirely original work in demonstrating the existence of capital, and therefore of capitalist relations of production in the USSR. Our divergences with previous Marxist analyses are of a sociological nature. Soviet capitalism differs from modern Western capitalism to the extent that Russian society is situated at a different historical level from that of Western countries. On both sides, these are divergent rates of development. Over the course of a few decades, the Russian economy has compensated for its secular backwardness in this area by a surprising acceleration of its technical and industrial progress. As imitation capitalism, the economic structure of the USSR was able, in the course of its construction, to use the whole range of methods of exploitation and organization implemented by Western capitalism from its genesis to its apogee. Footnote. See G.E. Akimov, Power in the Shadows. Published in Paris, 1953. Not seeing anything for this person. It says G.E. Akimov calls Soviet, quote, communism a, quote, replacement capitalism. This fact could also be considered from the point of view of the moral doctrine advocated in the USSR. See on this subject the work of Herbert Marcuse, Soviet Marxism. Quote, the common requirements of industrialization bring about a great similarity between the values characteristic of, quote, bourgeois and Soviet ethics. Such a similarity is manifested in the morality of work as well as in sexual morality, end quote. Marcuse. Still been meaning to read that book. End footnote. Schematically speaking, which is imposed on us by the framework of the present study, we can distinguish several stages in the formation of capital in the USSR since the fall of Tsarism and the conquest of power by the Bolsheviks. We could first speak of a very brief, quote, anti-capitalist period, marked by the takeover of factories by the workers, in parallel with the appropriation of land by the peasants after the Bolshevik coup d'etat of October. It was the Bolshevik government that legalized this attempt at worker self-management, while putting an end to this attempt at worker self-management by decreeing the nationalization of industry and workers' control under the authority of the state. 1. It intended to under the authority of the state, it intended to combine state capitalism and the dictatorship of the proletariat, following the formula dear to Lenin. Footnote. See E.H. Carr, A History of Soviet Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917 to 1923. Curiously, the author describes the autonomous actions of workers as, quote, syndicalistism. whereas E.H. Carr sees the, quote, essence of socialism in the planned economy coordinated by a, quote, central authority acting in the common interest. End footnote. During the Civil War, summer 1918 to autumn 1920, the economy collapsed, although the central administrations managed to organize and coordinate businesses, while the experiments of an economy without money and without capital, which circumstances imposed, was fiercely debated in the ranks of the party. To avoid a catastrophe, once the Civil War was over, it was necessary to renounce, quote, war communism and reestablish certain proven institutions and methods of classical capitalism. Tax first in kind, then in cash, replacing requisitions and the state monopoly on wheat, free trade, individual exploitation, industry, and commerce. The workers' trade union and anarcho-socialist oppositions were silenced by the party, hence the irresistible rise of a bloated bureaucracy, the maintenance of which would end up weighing mortally on the country's economy and would be a cause of failure for the new economic policy. The positive results of the new economic policy were nevertheless remarkable. It put an end to inflation by creating a stable currency backed by gold. It allowed Russia's overall production to reach its 1913 level by 1928 to 1929. It restored the national income and average per capita income to the 1913 level. Footnote. See Lucien Leroy, Review of the 25 Years of Soviet Plans, SNC, end footnote. Footnote. See S.N. Pakovitz, Economic History of the USSR, and footnote. J.Y. Calvez, National Income in the USSR. The author, relying on Soviet statistical sources, cites the following figures. From 14 billion rubles in 1913, the total national income rose to 16.1 billion in 1927 to 1928. The average income per capita rose during the same period from 100.4 rubles to 107.1 rubles. The evaluation is made in pre-war rubles. End footnote. The revolution, quote, proletarian and socialist, according to the wishes of the Bolshevik Party, nevertheless inflicted on the Soviet peoples the sacrifice of several million human victims. 5 million died of hunger, and there were thousands of cases of cannibalism. When we study the dynamics of the forces of production, which made this economic restoration possible during the new economic policy period, we see at once that its driving force, in the private sector as well as in the state-controlled sector of production, was merchant profit. Merchant profit. As Marx defined merchant profit in analyzing mercantile relations in the capitalist economy. This fact is indisputable if we consider the areas of agricultural production and small trade, in which the new economic policy re-established freedom of trade. As for the industrial and commercial enterprises nationalized since 1918 to 1920, the reestablishment by the NEP of the system of wages proportional to the output of work and of the management of enterprises on strictly commercial bases could have no other consequences than the formation of state enterprise on a national scale, an enterprise oriented in all its management and control activities towards a relatively slow accumulation of national capital. Footnote, quote, all those who have learned the ABC of Marxism know that the free circulation of products and freedom of trade will inevitably result in the division of producers into owners of capital and owners of labor power into capitalists and wage earners. In other words, we will see the reappearance of wage labor, which does not fall from the sky, but is the consequence throughout the world of commercial agriculture, end quote. Lenin's speech of the 15th of March, 1921, quoted by S.N. Kobovich. However, the speaker declared that the, quote, very foundations of this political power of the proletariat, end quote, would not be threatened by this partial restoration of private capitalism, quote, for it is a question of measure, end quote. End footnote. Footnote. During, quote, war communism, work was declared compulsory for all citizens, and in 1920 several labor armies were formed. The distribution of wages evolved towards complete equality, but in view of the rapid decline in the purchasing power of paper money, the remuneration of work was largely in kind. At the end of 1921, the wage for performance system replaced this system of payment, and the book labor contract was substituted for compulsory labor service. End footnote. The government had to do without foreign loans and investment, and this reconstruction of the economy during the NEP was carried out on the basis of almost exclusively domestic accumulation. Footnote, quote, in 1922 to 1923, about 4,000 of the country's 8,500 enterprises belonged to private or foreign capital, and this was the case for almost all domestic trade, end quote. Akimov. Quote, if an impoverished and ruined Russia, private accumulation was tiny. On the other hand, the forced accumulation of state capital, thanks to the nationalization of the country's main productive forces, and by means of a clever price policy, could provide very substantial investment funds, end quote. The policy of accumulation allowed by state enterprise could not be better formulated. End footnote. As early as 1923, symptoms of a serious economic crisis appeared. It was due to the growing gap between the prices of agricultural products and those of manufactured goods, but it concealed a profound antagonism between the interests of private commercial capital and state capital. Trotsky, then a fervent promoter of the state economic plan, expressed the social and political significance of this antagonism as follows, quote, if private capital were to gradually, slowly come to dominate Soviet capital, the Soviet apparatus would probably undergo a bourgeois degeneration, ... If private capital were to grow rapidly and to come into contact, to unite with the peasantry, then active counter-revolutionary tendencies against the party would probably prevail. End quote. Trotsky. Footnote. Leon Trotsky, The New Course, edited by Boris Souverin, 1924. In 1924, drawing up the balance sheet of the, quote, 3 years of NEP, a Soviet economist wrote, quote, the NEP was not only ... a period of socialist primitive accumulation, but also a period of capitalist primitive accumulation, whose methods of plunder were not inferior to those of other similar epochs, end quote. L. Chrisman, Heroic Period of the Great Russian Revolution, German edition, 1929. The author was still able to witness before his disappearance the methods of, quote, socialist primitive accumulation, and, quote, honored by Stalin. End footnote. Quote, everywhere one could feel the rising tide of capitalism, end quote, says Trotsky, who was then leading the opposition against Stalin's, quote, Kulak-oriented, end quote, policy, hostile to the acceleration of the pace of industrialization at the expense of the peasantry, that is, to quote, socialist accumulation, end quote. Footnote, see Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. End footnote. Two years later, in 1928, the opposition's political program and the testament found. 2 years later, in 1928, the opposition's political program and testament found an unexpected executor in Stalin, and his unfortunate advisors saw Stalin push docility to the point of undertaking the physical liquidation of the kulaks, quote, as a class, end quote. Let us agree, moreover, that there were more than theoretical nuances between Trotsky and Stalin. Footnote. Although the words of the historian of Bolshevism, Boris Souverin, quote, at a certain level of horror, the variations matter little, end quote, allow us to fill the gap between the repression of the Kronstadt Revolt, 1921, and the collective murder of hundreds of thousands of peasants, by which Stalin intended to end the, quote, first phase, end quote, of the development of the Soviet state. Boris Souverin quotes Lenin advising, quote, not to shrink from barbaric means to combat barbarism, end quote. That figure of, hundreds of thousands of peasants, it's more than that. It's up in the millions. End footnote. The central task that this state was to undertake by will of the ruling party in the, quote, second phase was the, quote, peaceful organization of the, quote, socialist economy. As in the first phase, the capital necessary for this, quote, expanded accumulation would come from domestic resources alone. Marx's Capital provided Stalin with the instructions for this creation ex nihilo, in this case the sub-proletarianized masses. Footnote. Quote, socialism in one country is in fact the attempt of an active political minority to industrialize an economically backward country by means borrowed from state and monopoly capitalism. See Irving Fetcher, Von Marx zur Soviet Ideologie, published in 1957. I have Irving Fetcher's book, Marx and Marxism, on this channel. Very good book. I would say Irving Fetcher and Maximilien Rubel are kind of like some of the best commentators of this post, or Marx of this post-war period. End footnote. In Capital, Marx described the historical genesis and growth of capitalism, a description that represents the most severe indictment ever made against the, quote, civilizing work of the bourgeoisie. However, they were transformed by the Bolshevik Party, master of the state, into so many economic and political recipes for building, quote, socialism in one country, end quote. The, quote, conscious manipulation of the theory of value had been enough to achieve the restoration of the country's economic potential during the years of the new economic policy. The, quote, conscious manipulation of the theory of value had been enough to achieve the restoration of the country's economic potential during the years of the new NEP. It remained to, quote, apply the theory of capital accumulation developed by Marx in the last chapters of his work, and this was the objective of, quote, planning. Planning means, without more, organizing on a national scale a systematic exploitation of the living force of labor according to the methods described by Marx concerning, quote, primitive accumulation, machinery and large-scale industry as sources of relative surplus value and absolute surplus value. Speaking of the effects of simple cooperation, Marx recalls the gigantic works of the ancient states of Asia and Egypt, which, having at their disposal the labor of the non-agricultural population, were able to erect immense monuments by the sole concentration of the efforts of these masses of arms. Quote, "This power of the kings of Asia and Egypt," end quote, Marx notes, quote, "of the Etruscan theocrats, etc., has, in modern society, fallen to the capitalist, whether he be isolated or as in joint stock companies combined," end quote. Marx. To create the Soviet big industry. The Bolshevik state, quote, combined all the methods of accumulation, primitive and refined, quote, in a systematic whole, embracing at the same time the colonial regime, public credit, modern finance, and the protectionist system, end quote. Marx highlighted the importance of the state in the genesis of capital, the social relation of production, by formulating a sort of sociological axiom, but it was up to, quote, Marxist statesmen to make this axiom a rule of political action. Quote, "Some of these methods are based on the use of brute force, but all without exception exploit the power of the state, the concentrated and organized force of society, in order to violently precipitate the passage from the feudal to the capitalist economic order and to shorten the phases of transition, and indeed force is the midwife of every old society in labor. The force is an economic agent," end quote. Marx, Capital. Turned into a maxim, this history lesson reveals to us the secret of the 5-year plans. Far from proceeding with the organization of a socialist society, these plans are in reality real tables of responsibilities, assigning to millions of workers the task necessary to obtain, at all costs, maximum production. ... So I'm assuming this is an excerpt from this piece, because of the ... But that's the end of the article. And again, that was Maximilien Rubel. Thank you for listening.